April 29, 1945, Dachau, Bavaria. The air tasted of ash and iron. A cold drizzle fell across the compound, turning the earth into gray mud that clung to everything it touched. The barbed wire gleamed wet in the pale morning light, strung between wooden posts that had stood witness to 12 years of mechanized cruelty. Beyond the wire, the women stood in silence. Not the silence of discipline, but the silence of those who have forgotten what it means to be seen as human. Their striped uniforms hung loose on skeletal frames. Their eyes, sunken deep in hollow faces, tracked the movements of the approaching soldiers with the wariness of animals who have learned that all uniforms bring pain. The American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division moved through the gate with weapons at the ready, their boots heavy against the muddy ground. They had fought their way across France, through the Vosges mountains, across the Rhine. They had seen cities reduced to rubble, villages emptied of life, forests turned to splinters. They believed they understood war. They believed they had witnessed the full catalogue of human suffering. They were wrong. What the soldiers of the 45th Infantry encountered that April morning would fracture something fundamental in their understanding of civilization itself. Among the approximately 32,000 prisoners they liberated that day, several thousand were women. German women, Polish women, Russian women, Czech women, women whose only crimes had been their blood, their beliefs, their refusal to surrender their humanity to the machinery of the Reich. These women had survived what was designed to be unsurvivable. They had endured starvation calculated to the calorie, labor measured in the slow erosion of tissue and bone, medical experiments that violated every principle of science and mercy. They had watched their sisters, their mothers, their daughters disappear into the crematorium smoke that rose day and night from the chimneys. They expected nothing from liberation except perhaps a different kind of death. The war had taught the Third Reich's servants a particular relationship to women. In the Nazi imagination, women were vessels for childbearing, for labor, for experimentation, for disposal. The SS guards who had run Dachau and its sub-camps treated female prisoners with a casual brutality that was somehow more chilling than rage. There was no anger in how they worked women to death in the armament factories. There was no passion in how they withheld food until bodies consumed themselves. There was only the cold efficiency of a system that had calculated the precise minimum required to extract labor from flesh before discarding it. The women who survived learned to make themselves invisible. They learned to avoid eye contact, to move without attracting attention, to become shadows. To be noticed by a guard meant punishment or worse. To be selected meant the medical block or the gas chamber. Their striped uniforms erased their identities. Their shaved heads erased their femininity. The numbers tattooed on their arms erased their names. The system had reduced them to units of production, and when they could no longer produce, they became units scheduled for elimination. This was the logic that governed their existence. This was the only transaction they understood with men in uniform. When Lieutenant Felix Sparks led his men through the gates of Dachau that morning, he carried with him an entirely different set of assumptions. Assumptions forged not in the darkness of totalitarian ideology, but in the complicated, imperfect, struggling democracy of the United States. American soldiers had been raised on stories of women who were mothers, teachers, nurses, factory workers. Even those who had never questioned the limitations placed on women in their own society carried within them the fundamental belief that women were to be protected, respected, treated with a baseline of human dignity. The United States Military Code of Conduct explicitly required soldiers to treat prisoners humanely, regardless of gender. The Geneva Conventions, which America had signed and which guided military conduct, established clear protocols for the treatment of prisoners of war, with special provisions for women. But nothing in the Code of Military Justice, nothing in the Geneva Conventions, nothing in their training or experience had prepared these American soldiers for what they found at Dachau. The first compound they entered held women in a separate section. The soldiers moved cautiously, unsure what they would encounter. They had liberated other camps, smaller facilities, prisoner-of-war camps, But the reports filtering back from Patton's Third Army about what they had found at Buchenwald had been almost impossible to believe. Now, as they pushed through the inner gates, they saw the reports had not been exaggerated. If anything, words had failed to capture the reality. Bodies lay stacked like cordwood along the walls. The living moved among the dead with the slow, mechanical movements of automatons. The stench was overwhelming. Human waste, decay, disease, and beneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of death. Some soldiers turned away to vomit. Others simply froze, their minds refusing to process what their eyes reported. And everywhere, the women watched. They stood in the doorways of their barracks, leaning against the walls for support. They huddled in small groups in the mud of the parade ground. They stared at the American soldiers with expressions that held no hope, no relief, no emotion at all. They had learned that men in uniform brought only suffering, and the fact that these uniforms were a different color meant nothing. Uniforms were uniforms. Soldiers were soldiers, and soldiers used women and discarded them. Private First Class. John Lee, a farm boy from Iowa who had celebrated his 21st birthday somewhere in the forests of Belgium, would later write in his diary about the moment he truly understood where he was. "We thought we were liberating a prison camp," he wrote in his cramped, unsteady handwriting. "We thought we'd find soldiers, prisoners of war, like the ones we'd freed in France. We found hell instead. And the women, God, the women. They looked at us like we were monsters, like they expected us to shoot them. Some of them just stood there waiting for it. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch. They just waited to die." The American officers quickly organized their men. Medical teams were summoned. Supplies were requisitioned. Orders went out to begin distributing food and water, to provide medical care, to separate the living from the dead. And throughout all of this, the soldiers struggled with a question that had no clear answer. How do you treat victims who cannot comprehend that they are no longer prisoners? The women had been conditioned by years of brutality to expect violence from any interaction with uniformed men. When American soldiers approached to offer food, many cowered. When medics tried to examine them, some screamed or went rigid with terror. The damage was not just physical, though the physical damage was catastrophic, but psychological. The Nazi system had not merely imprisoned their bodies, it had colonized their capacity to imagine safety. Sergeant William Walsh from Boston, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, found himself standing before a group of perhaps 24 women who had collapsed in the mud near one of the barracks. They were beyond emaciated, their bodies little more than skin stretched over bone. Several appeared to be dying. He had his medic with him, a kid from Philadelphia named Morrison, who couldn't have been more than 19. Walsh called out in his rough German, trying to tell them that help was here, that they were safe now, that they were free. The women didn't move. They stared at him with flat, dead eyes. Morrison stepped forward with his medical bag, and the woman closest to him recoiled so violently she fell onto her side in the mud. The sound she made wasn't a scream, it was something more primal, a noise of pure animal terror. Walsh put his hand on Morrison's shoulder and stopped him. For a long moment, the sergeant stood there, trying to understand what he was seeing. These women weren't injured soldiers who needed medical care. They were creatures who had been so thoroughly broken by systematic cruelty that the sight of a man in uniform trying to help them triggered only terror. And then Walsh did something that had not been ordered, that was not part of any protocol, that came not from his training, but from some deeper place, from the memory, perhaps, of his own mother, who had raised 4 sons alone during the Depression, who had worked in a textile mill for pennies, who had taught him that dignity was not something you earned but something you possessed by virtue of being human. He stepped back, he came to attention, and he saluted. It was a gesture that made no military sense. You didn't salute prisoners, you didn't salute civilians, you certainly didn't salute women who were lying in the mud wearing concentration camp uniforms. But Walsh saluted anyway. A crisp, clean military salute that acknowledged not what these women had been reduced to, but what they remained despite everything. Human beings worthy of respect. The woman who had recoiled from Morrison stopped making that terrible sound. She stared at Walsh with an expression of utter confusion. Around her, the other women began to stir, to look up, to notice this strange inversion of every rule they had learned. Morrison, understanding suddenly what his sergeant was doing, came to attention and saluted as well. Then the soldier beside him, then another, then another. A line of American soldiers standing at attention in the mud and ash of Dachau, saluting a group of dying women who had been designated as less than human by the machinery of Nazi racial theory. The women didn't understand at first. How could they? For years, the only time they had seen guards come to attention was before selections, before violence, before death. A salute meant someone important was watching, which meant someone would be punished. But as the seconds stretched and the Americans held their salute, something began to shift in the air between captor and captive, liberator and liberated. One of the women, a Polish nurse named Krystyna Jewulska, who had survived 3 years in the Dachau system and would later write one of the most searing memoirs of the camps, slowly, painfully, pushed herself up from the mud. Her legs shook with the effort. She swayed, nearly fell, caught herself. She looked at Walsh, and for the first time in years, something flickered in her eyes that might have been recognition. Recognition that she was being seen. Not as a prisoner, not as a number, not as a unit of expendable labor, but as a person. She tried to stand straighter. Her body, ravaged by starvation and abuse, could barely comply, but she tried. And then, with a movement that cost her nearly all her remaining strength, she raised her skeletal hand and returned the salute. The effect on the other women was immediate. Some began to weep, terrible, silent weeping without sound, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on their faces. Others simply stared, unable to process this violation of every pattern they had learned. A few, those who retained enough strength, began to pull themselves upright, to stand, to be seen standing. Walsh held his salute until every woman who could stand was standing. Then he lowered his hand, and his men lowered theirs. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then he and Morrison moved forward slowly, carefully, treating these broken women with the kind of cautious respect you might show to something precious and irreparably damaged. This time, when Morrison opened his medical bag, the women did not recoil. The gesture, simple, unremarkable by military standards, spread through the 45th Infantry Division that day with the speed of revelation. Word passed from squad to squad, company to company. The men had found an answer to the question that had paralyzed them. How do you restore humanity to people from whom humanity has been systematically stripped? You treat them as if their humanity had never been in question. You grant them the dignity that the system had tried to erase. Throughout that long, terrible day of liberation, as American soldiers moved through the compounds of Dachau, encountering horror after horror, they repeated Walsh's gesture. They saluted the women prisoners. They saluted men so weak they could barely stand. They saluted the barely alive who emerged from the barracks like ghosts. It was not military protocol. It was not in any manual. It was an improvised gesture of recognition, an acknowledgement that whatever the Nazis had tried to do, these people remained worthy of respect. The symbolism of the salute carried weight beyond its immediate emotional impact. In the military culture from which these American soldiers emerged, the salute was a gesture that flowed upward. Junior officers saluted senior officers. Enlisted men saluted anyone with rank. It was the acknowledgement of authority, of hierarchy, of structured power. But it was also, in its origins, a gesture of respect. Medieval knights raised their visors to show their faces, to demonstrate they meant no harm. That gesture evolved into the military salute, a sign that said, "I see you, I acknowledge you, I offer you respect." When American soldiers saluted the women prisoners of Dachau, they were inverting the entire logic of the Nazi system. The Third Reich had built its empire on a rigid hierarchy of human worth. Aryans at the top, then a descending scale of Slavs, Southern European, Asian, and at the very bottom, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled, those deemed lebensunwertes Leben, lives unworthy of life. Women within these categories occupied an even lower status, valued only for their potential labor or their capacity to be used and discarded. The American salute said, "This hierarchy is a lie. Your worth is not determined by your race, your religion, your nation, your gender. You possess inherent dignity that no system can eliminate. We see it, we acknowledge it, we honor it. For the women who received these salutes, the gesture began to crack the psychological chains that bound them even after the physical chains had been removed. Jawolska would later write about that moment with Walsh, describing how something frozen inside her began, impossibly, to thaw. For 3 years, she wrote, I had been taught that I was vermin, that my life had no value, that my death would be a service to humanity's progress. I had half believed it. How could I not believe it when everything around me confirmed it every moment of every day? But when that American sergeant saluted me, in my lice-infested rags, covered in mud, and my own filth, barely able to stand, I remembered that I had once been a nurse. I had once healed people. I had once been Christina, with a family and a future. The Nazis had taken everything, but they had not succeeded in taking that. Not completely. The liberation of Dachau was not a clean, simple moment of victory. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry arrived to find scenes so horrific that some of them snapped. There was a massacre. SS guards shot in rage by American soldiers who had just witnessed boxcars full of corpses, gas chambers, medical experimentation rooms. Military justice would later grapple with these killings, trying to sort legitimate combat from war crimes, but on that day, in that moment, the line between justice and vengeance became nearly impossible to draw. But amid the rage and horror, there were also these moments. American soldiers offering salutes to people the Nazi regime had designated as disposable. Medics treating women with the kind of gentle care they would offer their own mothers. Officers ensuring that female prisoners received separate facilities, protection from potential abuse, access to women doctors when possible. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 3rd Battalion that liberated the main camp, issued explicit orders that all prisoners were to be treated with respect and dignity, and that any soldier who violated those orders would face court-martial. This was not universal. Some American soldiers, products of their own imperfect society, brought their prejudices with them. There were incidents of disrespect, of insensitivity, even of abuse. The United States military of 1945 was still segregated, still grappling with its own contradictions about human worth and human dignity. But the overwhelming majority of the men who liberated Dachau tried, often clumsily, to offer something different from what these prisoners had experienced, to offer recognition instead of erasure, dignity instead of degradation. The contrast between what the women prisoners expected and what they received reflected a larger contrast between two competing visions of civilization itself. The Nazi ideology that had created and sustained Dachau rested on a foundation of hierarchy, power, and the belief that human worth could be measured and quantified. It was a system that took the worst human impulses, tribalism, cruelty, the desire to dominate, and elevated them into a philosophy of state. It promised its followers that they were superior, that their power was justified by their blood, that the weak existed to serve the strong or be eliminated. The American soldiers who arrived at Dachau carried with them a different, if imperfectly realized, vision. The United States had its own sins: slavery, segregation, the internment of Japanese Americans, the genocide of native peoples. The gap between American ideals and American reality was vast and troubling. But those ideals existed, and they exerted pressure on reality. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men were created equal, a lie at the time it was written, true only for white property-owning men, but a lie that contained within it a truth that would take centuries to unfold. The Constitution promised rights that were systematically denied to vast numbers of Americans, but those promises were written down, and over generations, Americans would appeal to them, fight for them, die for them, and slowly, painfully, expand them. The soldiers at Dachau were products of that imperfect system. They had grown up with images of democracy, however flawed. They had been taught, however incompletely, that power should be limited, that individuals had rights, that there were rules that constrained even the strong. Most had never examined these ideas critically, never considered their philosophical implications. They were just American boys who wanted to go home. But when confronted with the pure distillation of totalitarian ideology at Dachau, something in them revolted. The salute was an expression of that revulsion, a gesture that said simply, "This is wrong. You are people. We see you as people. The women of Dachau were not the only female prisoners liberated by Allied forces in the spring of 1945. Nor was Dachau the only camp where soldiers struggled with how to restore humanity to people systematically dehumanized. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, liberated by Soviet forces. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British. At the subcamps of Auschwitz, liberated by Soviet troops, similar scenes played out. But there was something particular about the American response at Dachau, the spontaneous, improvised decision to salute, that captured the imagination and became symbolic. Perhaps it because the gesture was so clearly not scripted, not ordered from above, but generated from the ranks by soldiers trying to solve an immediate human problem. How do you tell someone who has been treated as less than human that you see them as human? Words seemed inadequate. Food and medicine were necessary but clinical. Physical touch was potentially traumatic, but a salute communicated across the distance, a formal recognition that required nothing from its recipient except to be seen. A salute could convey respect without demanding anything in return. Women who were saluted that day carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. In testimonies recorded decades later for archives and memorial institutions, survivors returned again and again to those first moments of liberation, to the shock of being treated with dignity. Anna Andlauer, a German political prisoner who had survived 4 years at Dachau, described in a 1985 interview how she had been standing near the wire when American soldiers entered. "I expected them to march us somewhere else," she said, her voice still carrying traces of disbelief 4 decades later. "I expected more orders, more violence. That's what soldiers did. But these soldiers looked at us like we mattered. One of them saw me and he stopped, and he saluted me. Me! I was 42 years old. I weighed maybe 35 kilograms. I was wearing rags. I probably looked like a monster. And this young soldier, he couldn't have been more than 20. He stopped and saluted me. I started to cry. I couldn't stop crying. Not because I was happy. I was too empty to be happy, but because something had broken. Some barrier between me and the rest of humanity. He saluted me, and I understood I was allowed to be a person again. The salute became, for many of these women, a symbolic marker, the boundary between the time when they were numbers and the time when they became names again. It was not, of course, the only thing that mattered. They needed food, medicine, shelter, time to heal. Many would struggle for years with what today we would recognize as severe PTSD. Some would never fully recover. The damage done by the Nazi camp system was meant to be permanent, and for many, it was. But symbols matter. Gestures matter. The way we treat people in moments of vulnerability shapes not just their recovery, but their ability to believe that recovery is possible. The American soldiers who saluted the women of Dachau were offering more than respect. They were offering the possibility of a future in which these women could imagine themselves as something other than victims, as survivors, as people who had endured the worst of human cruelty and remained, fundamentally, human. The military brass, when they learned about the saluting, were initially confused. It violated protocol. It blurred the lines between military and civilian, between captor and freed. But they were pragmatic enough to recognize that in this unprecedented situation, rigid adherence to protocol was less important than accomplishing the mission. And the mission was not just defeating the Nazi military, but also preserving the lives and humanity of those the Nazis had tried to destroy. After initial uncertainty, officers throughout the theater began encouraging the practice. It became semi-official policy. Treat camp survivors with the respect you would show to fellow soldiers, to honored guests, to people of value. This created some bizarre juxtapositions. Officers who would never salute civilian officials back home found themselves saluting skeletal figures in striped rags. Enlisted men who had been drilled in the rigid hierarchies of military protocol stood at attention before people who had been systematically stripped of all status. But these inversions made sense in context. The usual rules didn't apply because the usual conditions didn't exist. This was something new in human history, the mechanized industrial attempt to eliminate entire categories of human beings. The response required something beyond the usual military playbook. The American military's approach to the liberated camps was not purely altruistic. There were strategic considerations. Eisenhower ordered that German civilians from nearby towns be marched through the camps to witness what had been done in their names, partly to prevent future denial, but also to psychologically defeat any lingering Nazi sympathies. Photographers and journalists were brought in to document everything, creating a permanent record. The camps were preserved as evidence for war crimes trials. But within these strategic calculations, there was also genuine moral outrage and a sincere attempt to help the survivors. The women prisoners noticed this complexity. They were not naive. Many of them were politically sophisticated, had been imprisoned precisely because they had resisted the Nazi regime, and they could distinguish between propaganda and authentic human feeling. What struck them was not that every American soldier was a saint, they weren't, but that the American system, for all its flaws, operated on fundamentally different principles than the Nazi system. American soldiers could be ordered to show respect, and most would comply because respect for human dignity was at least theoretically part of their value system. Nazi guards had been ordered to show cruelty, and they complied because cruelty in service of racial hierarchy was their value system. This difference mattered enormously to the survivor. It suggested that their suffering had meaning, not that it was justified, never that, but that it had occurred within a larger human struggle between systems that valued life and systems that treated life as disposable. They had been victims of one system and were now being rescued by another. The system rescuing them was imperfect, inconsistent, often hypocritical, but it was different. The salute embodied that difference. In the weeks after liberation, as the survivors slowly began to recover physical strength, the psychological work of recovery proved more challenging. Many women who had been saluted by American soldiers at liberation found themselves unable to accept the gesture's meaning. Years of conditioning couldn't be erased by a single moment of respect. They flinched from kindness because kindness had so often been a prelude to cruelty. They mistrusted food because food had been used as a tool of control. They couldn't sleep in soft beds because soft beds felt dangerously vulnerable after years of wooden bunks. The American military government brought in doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, people who tried to understand and treat what was then called concentration camp syndrome, and what we would now recognize as complex trauma. But the most effective healing often came from simple, repeated gestures of normalcy and respect. Soldiers who continued to treat the women as people worthy of consideration. Relief workers who asked for their preferences rather than simply telling them what to do. The slow, difficult process of giving them choices again. Choices about food, clothing, where to sleep, where to go. Choices that acknowledged they had agency over their own lives. The salute was the beginning of this process, not the end. It opened a door that had been welded shut, but walking through that door required courage that many survivors had to rebuild piece by piece, day by day. Some of the women who recovered enough to speak about their experiences talked about the salute in broader political and philosophical terms. Halina Berenbaum, a Polish Jewish survivor who had endured Auschwitz before being transferred to Dachau's subcamps, later wrote about how the American treatment contrasted with what she had known. "The Nazis saw us and decided we should not exist," she wrote. "The Americans saw us and decided we must be helped to exist again. This seems like a small difference, but it is the difference between civilization and barbarism. The Nazis were efficient, organized, modern. They used the latest technology, the best science, the most advanced management techniques, but they used all of this in service of death. The Americans were often disorganized, confused, unsure what to do with us, but they used what they had in service of life. When that soldier saluted me, he was saying, 'My system values your existence.' I thought I had forgotten what that felt like." The contrast between technological sophistication and moral purpose became a recurring theme in survivor testimony. The Nazi camp system was a marvel of brutal efficiency. Carefully calculated calorie restrictions, precisely timed labor assignments, industrial-scale killing methods that maximized throughput while minimizing cost. It represented a dark version of modernity, where human rationality was deployed in service of the most irrational goal imaginable, the elimination of entire people. The American response was often messy and improvised. Soldiers shared their own rations, even though doing so violated orders about introducing too much food too quickly to starving bodies. Medics tried treatments that didn't work. Officers made decisions on the fly. But underlying all this improvisation was a fundamental respect for the value of human life. The salute symbolized this. It wasn't efficient, it served no tactical purpose. It made no sense in terms of military protocol. It was simply a gesture of recognition, human to human. As the immediate crisis of liberation gave way to the longer work of recovery and rebuilding, the symbolic importance of those first moments grew. Survivors who wrote memoirs or gave testimony returned to the salutes, to the kindness of the liberators, as evidence that humanity could be restored, that the Nazi vision of the world was not inevitable, that another way was possible. This testimony has shaped historical memory of the liberation. There is a tendency in some popular narratives to romanticize the Americans, to paint them as pure saviors riding in to rescue helpless victims. The reality was more complicated. Some American soldiers were racist, anti-Semitic, or simply indifferent. The U.S. military was still operating under segregation, with black soldiers often assigned to support roles rather than combat. The American government had turned away Jewish refugees before the war, had been slow to acknowledge the full scale of the Holocaust, had prioritized military victory over rescue. These failures and contradictions don't erase the genuine attempts at humanity that many individual soldiers displayed, but they complicate the narrative. The women of Dachau understood these complications. They were grateful for liberation, but they were also clear-eyed about the imperfections of their liberators. What mattered to them was not that Americans were perfect, but that the American system, at its best, aspired to something better than what they had experienced under Nazi rule. The salute represented that aspiration, imperfectly realized, inconsistently applied, but real. In the years after the war, as survivors scattered across the world and tried to rebuild lives from ruin, many maintained connections to the soldiers who had liberated them. Letters crossed oceans, reunions were arranged, friendships formed. These relationships were often awkward, marked by the unbridgeable gap between those who had experienced the camps and those who had only witnessed them briefly. But they mattered. They were evidence that the connection forged at liberation, the moment when soldiers saluted prisoners and acknowledged their humanity, could extend beyond that moment into something lasting. Sergeant William Walsh, the Boston soldier whose spontaneous salute had sparked the practice, never spoke publicly about what he had done. He returned home, married his childhood sweetheart, worked in his father's plumbing business, raised 4 children. He told his family almost nothing about the war, but he kept, in a drawer in his bedroom, a single photograph, a blurry image of skeletal women standing in the mud at Dachau, taken by a Signal Corps photographer on Liberation Day. On the back, in pencil, he had written just 2 words, "Never forget." His daughter found the photograph after his death in 1987 and tried to learn its story. She contacted veteran organizations, Holocaust museums, historian. Eventually, she connected with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and through them found Krystyna Żywulska, the Polish nurse who had returned Walsh's salute that April morning. Żywulska was living in Warsaw, working as a writer and activist. She was in her 70s, still sharp, still engaged with the world. When Walsh's daughter called to tell her about her father's death, Żywulska went silent for a long moment. Then she said, in her accented English, "Your father gave me back my life. Not by freeing me. The war was ending. Someone would have freed us eventually. He gave me back my life by treating me like a human being at the moment when I had forgotten I was one. Please tell your family that he was a good man. Please tell them that what he did mattered." The exchange captured something essential about the power of small gestures in moments of extremity. Walsh had probably forgotten the salute within days, or remembered it only as one small incident in the overwhelming horror of liberation. But for Żywulska, it had been a turning point, the moment when she began to believe she could survive, not just physically, but psychologically, that she could become more than her trauma. This asymmetry of meaning is characteristic of encounters between the powerful and the powerless. What seems like a small kindness from a position of strength can be life-altering from a position of desperate vulnerability. The American soldiers had the luxury of treating the salute as a minor gesture. The women prisoners, who had been systematically stripped of dignity, experienced it as a radical act of recognition. The liberation of Dachau and the salutes exchanged there became part of the larger narrative Americans told themselves about the war. The United States had entered World War II reluctantly after Pearl Harbor forced the issue. But once engaged, Americans came to understand the conflict as a moral crusade, a war not just for territory or power, but for fundamental human value. The discovery of the concentration camps seemed to validate this understanding. Here was evil, undeniable and absolute. And here were Americans, stopping that evil and treating its victims with dignity. This narrative was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. It overlooked the racism and imperialism that had characterized American expansion. It ignored the firebombing of civilian populations, the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the casual cruelties of occupation. It simplified a complex war into a story of good versus evil, heroes versus villains. But narratives, even simplified ones, have power. The story of American soldiers saluting the women of Dachau became a story Americans told about themselves, about who they wanted to be, about what their values required of them. And stories like that, repeated often enough, can shape behavior. They create standards against which actions can be measured. They provide models for how to act in moments of moral choice. The women who were saluted understood this. Many of them, in later years, spoke at schools and community centers, trying to pass on the lessons of their experience. They talked about the Holocaust, about the camps, about the systematic attempt to eliminate them. But they also talked about liberation, about the American soldiers who had treated them with respect, about the salute. They used these stories to teach about the power of human decency even in the darkest circumstances. One survivor, speaking to a group of high school students in the 1990s, put it this way: "The Nazis taught us that humans can become monsters. The Americans taught us that humans can choose not to be monsters. Both lessons are important. The first warns us about what we must never allow. The second gives us hope that we can prevent it." This framing, the salute as a symbol of the human capacity for choice, for decency, for resistance to dehumanization, became increasingly important as the survivors aged and the Holocaust moved from lived experience to historical memory. The generation that had witnessed the camps directly was dying. Soon, there would be no one left who could testify from personal experience. The salute, captured in photographs and preserved in testimony, became a way to communicate across that gap, a concrete, specific gesture that embodied larger truths about humanity, dignity, and the choices we make when confronted with suffering. The symbolic power of the salute extended beyond the Holocaust survivor community. In the decades after the war, as the United States struggled with civil rights, with Vietnam, with the question of what it meant to be American, the image of soldiers saluting concentration camp prisoners circulated as a reminder of what America could be at its best. It was used by activists arguing for racial equality, by veterans opposing the Vietnam War, by anyone trying to call the nation back to its stated principles. This usage was sometimes cynical, sometimes sincere, but it spoke to the enduring power of the gesture. The salute at Dachau had become a symbol, and symbols can be wielded in different ways for different purposes. But at the core of all these uses was the same basic idea, that human dignity must be recognized and respected, that systems which deny dignity must be opposed, that small gestures of respect can matter enormously in moments of crisis. The women who received those salutes would have recognized this appropriation of their experience with mixed feelings. Some were pleased that their suffering had become part of a larger narrative about human rights and human dignity. Others were uncomfortable with how their trauma had been simplified and deployed for political purposes. But most understood that this was how memory worked. Experiences were transformed into stories. Stories became symbols. Symbols were used to teach lessons and inspire action. What they insisted on, in their testimony and their writing, was that the symbol remain connected to the reality. The salute mattered because it occurred in a specific place, at a specific time, in a specific context. It was not an abstract gesture of respect, but a concrete response to concrete horror. To honor its meaning required understanding that horror, not sanitizing it or abstracting it away. This insistence on historical specificity became increasingly urgent as the survivors aged. They had seen too many attempts to relativize the Holocaust, to compare it casually to other atrocities, to use it as a metaphor detached from its particular facts. They knew that the power of the salute as a symbol depended on understanding what it was responding to: the industrial machinery of genocide, the bureaucratic efficiency of death, the systematic attempt to eliminate entire peoples. The American soldiers who saluted the women of Dachau were responding to this specific evil. Their gesture was meaningful because it stood in direct opposition to the logic of the camps. It said, "You are human, you matter, you deserve respect." This seems obvious, even trivial, until you understand the context. Years of propaganda insisting these women were subhuman, endless labor designed to work them to death, medical experiments that treated them as laboratory animals, gas chambers that eliminated those too weak to work. Against this machinery of dehumanization, the salute was an act of radical recognition. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough, but it was something. It was a gesture toward a different way of organizing human society, one that recognized the inherent worth of every person regardless of race, religion, nationality, or gender. This ideal was imperfectly realized in 1945, and it remains imperfectly realized today. But the gap between ideal and reality creates pressure for change. The American soldiers who saluted the women of Dachau were not perfect representatives of a perfect system. They were flawed people from a flawed nation trying to do the right thing in a moment of crisis. That they mostly succeeded, that they managed to offer dignity to people systematically denied dignity, speaks to the power of ideals, even when those ideals are incompletely understood and inconsistently applied. As the last survivors of Dachau died, as the living memory of the Holocaust faded into historical record, the salute remained, captured in photographs, preserved in testimony, embedded in museum exhibitions and educational materials. It became a teaching tool, a way to help new generations understand both the depths to which humans can sink and the heights to which we can rise. The women who stood frozen when American soldiers saluted them eventually unfroze. They recovered, slowly and incompletely. They emigrated, or returned home, or settled in displaced persons camps. They married, had children, built careers, created lives. They carried their trauma with them. It never left, but they carried also the memory of that moment when soldiers acknowledged their humanity. For many, that memory became a touchstone, a reminder that even after the worst humans can do to each other, repair is possible. Dignity can be restored. Life can continue. This is perhaps the deepest meaning of the salute. Not that it fixed what was broken. It couldn't. But that it signaled the possibility of repair. The Nazi system had tried to make these women believe they were not human. The salute said, "That was a lie. You are human. We see you. We honor you. Begin again." And impossibly, incredibly, many of them did. May 1945. The camps are liberated. The women are free. But freedom after such captivity is strange and frightening. They learn to eat again, slowly. Because their bodies have forgotten how to process food. They learn to sleep, though nightmares tear them awake. They learn to walk without shuffling, to speak without whispers, to raise their eyes, to remember their names. Some die anyway. Liberation comes too late, their bodies too damaged, their spirits too fractured. Others survive, but never truly leave the camps. The wire remains in their minds, the terror in their bones. But some, not all, but enough, manage to build new lives from the ruins. They become teachers, writers, doctors, activists. They marry, have children, plant gardens, bake bread, celebrate holidays. They carry their numbers, tattooed or burned into memory. But they do not let those numbers define them. And when they tell their stories, when they speak to students or journalists or grandchildren, they often return to that moment at liberation, to the young American soldiers who looked at them with horror and compassion, to the officer who saluted, to the medic who treated them gently, to the small gestures that said, "You are not what they made you. You are not a number. You are not vermin. You are human, and you are seen, and you matter." These stories carry weight because they are true, not metaphorically true or symbolically true, but actually, historically, factually true. These things happened. These gestures were made. These women stood in the mud of Dachau and received salutes from American soldiers, and it meant something. It meant that the Nazi vision of the world was false, that hierarchies of human worth are not natural but constructed, and what is constructed can be dismantled. That dignity is not earned but inherent, and no system, however powerful, can fully erase it. That cruelty is a choice, and so is kindness, and in the moment of choice, everything hangs in the balance. The salute was a choice, improvised, unauthorized, emerging from the conscience of individual soldiers confronted with suffering beyond imagination. It was not the only choice available. The soldiers could have treated the prisoners with clinical detachment, as damaged goods to be processed. They could have responded with disgust or fear. They could have seen only the dehumanized shells the Nazis had tried to create. Instead, they looked deeper. They saw past the striped uniforms and the skeletal bodies and the hollow eyes. They saw people. And having seen people, they responded as their imperfect, inconsistent, struggling democracy had taught them to respond. With recognition, with respect, with the formal acknowledgement that these were human beings deserving of dignity. This was not inevitable. History is full of liberators who became oppressors, of victors who treated the defeated with contempt, of power that corrupted even good intentions. The American response was far from perfect. There were failures, crimes, betrayals. But at Dachau, on that April day, when Sergeant Walsh and his men saluted those women in the mud, something happened that was right and true and worthy of memory. The women never forgot. Long after the camps were empty, after the war was history, after Germany was rebuilt and the world moved on, they remembered. They remembered standing in the mud, expecting nothing, receiving recognition. They remembered the young soldiers who looked at them with tears in their eyes and treated them like they mattered. They remembered learning, slowly and painfully, that they did matter, that the Nazi lie was just that, a lie, and that humanity could be reclaimed even from the edge of annihilation. This is the truth the salute embodied, that we are not the worst that is done to us, that dignity can be stripped away but also restored, that systems built on dehumanization will eventually fall, and people of conscience will stand in their ruins and offer recognition to those who survived. The women of Dachau stood frozen when American soldiers saluted them because they had forgotten that such gestures were possible. They had lived so long in a world where every interaction with authority brought pain that kindness had become literally unimaginable. The salute broke through that conditioning. It said, "The world you knew is ending. A different world, an imperfect but improvable world, is beginning. You are welcome in it. You belong in it. You are seen in it." And one by one, the women began to move again, to stand straighter, to return the salute, to remember, against all the machinery of forgetting, who they had been and who they might become again. This is what liberation looked like. Not a clean moment of victory, but a messy, painful, halting process of recognizing and restoring humanity. It began with a salute. It continued with food and medicine and kindness and time. It continues still, wherever people choose recognition over erasure, dignity over degradation, the hard work of honoring humanity over the easy cruelty of denying it. The camps are gone now, bulldozed or preserved as memorials. The soldiers are dead, the women are dead, but the gesture remains, captured in memory and testimony and history, a small light against the great darkness of what humans can do to each other, evidence of what we can also do: see each other, honor each other, salute not rank or power, but the irreducible fact of our shared humanity. In the end, that may be all we can do, but in moments of darkness, when the machinery of cruelty seems unstoppable, when systems of dehumanization appear impregnable, It is enough. It has to be enough. Because the alternative, to accept that cruelty wins, that dehumanization is permanent, that dignity once stripped cannot be restored, is to surrender to the logic that built the camps. The women of Dachau refused that surrender. Against all reason, against all evidence, they found within themselves the strength to stand, to accept recognition, to begin again. And the American soldiers who saluted them in their fumbling, improvised way helped make that beginning possible. This is the story we inherit. This is the charge laid upon us, to see humanity even where systems have tried to erase it, to offer recognition even when recognition costs nothing but demands everything, to salute not power, but persistence, not rank, but resilience, not authority, but the stubborn, unreasonable, magnificent refusal of the human spirit to be finally and completely destroyed. The women stood frozen, the soldiers saluted, and in that gesture, in that moment, something essential was preserved and passed forward. The knowledge that we can choose differently, that the worst of what we are need not define us, that dignity, once acknowledged, can never be completely denied again. This is the truth that echoes across the decades from that April morning. We are human. We see each other. We honor each other. We begin again. Always. Impossibly. We begin again.